the warrior queen. Rome took everything from her, and when there was nothing left to take, Rome took her body against her will, and then they took the bodies of her young daughters and abused them. So in response, Boudica slaughtered all the Romans.
And not just the men, but the women and the children too.
Boudica was a warrior queen who purged England from the Roman infection and brought an empire to its knees. We're talking about a woman leading an army largely made up of women who went toe-to-toe with the world's greatest empire. I mean, this sounds like some ultra-feminist, extra-woke fan fiction, but it's actual history. And it all started with the Romans doing what they did best. They saw unconquered lands and said,
"Mine."
In this case, the Romans were going after the lands of the Celts. And when I say Celts, I don't mean one specific nation. The term encompasses many people, dozens of tribes, each with distinct customs, distinct traditions, even different languages. These tribes, these Celts, were not united either, but actually constantly battling each other, and Rome knew an enemy divided is an enemy easily conquered. Remember that next time you try to move up the social ladder in school, kids? Spread lies, make them enemies, divide and conquer. Life advice. To the Romans, the Celts were nothing but uncivilized barbarians, which the Romans pretty much said about anyone that wasn't them. But in the case of the Celts, I mean, these guys went into battle naked, covered in painted runes, screaming and making animal noises, so I think the Romans had a point in this case. But outside of combat, the Celts were actually the first society that paved roads, an invention Rome later stole and claimed they came up with, like me with half of my jokes. And the Celts were also the first to have chainmail, so they were not really uncivilized, just hardcore exhibitionists when it came to fighting. In fact, the Celts even had women in leading positions, and one could argue that an ancient society that allows women to hold high positions within that society and their military is very civilized and more advanced than even some people in our contemporary world. Among the Celts, women had actually held high positions for centuries, even becoming druids, which sounds like some fantastical thing now, but at the time, druids within Celtic society were basically the bee's knees, man. They weren't combat shapeshifters like they are in video games, but if you want to play a shapeshifter druid, you can download Baldur's Gate 3 from Instant Gaming, because Instant Gaming has that game, because Instant Gaming has every game, and they have every game way cheaper than anybody else. Yes, you just got plugged. Wait, that came out wrong. There are other games where you can play a druid, like the Pathfinder games, or you can play the Hellblade games, which don't have druids but have serious Boudica vibes. It doesn't matter what you're looking for, Instant Gaming has it all, and they have it discounted, so you can save your money and do useful things with it, like...
Hey fellas! Look what I found in my pocket! Look! A year's salary right here! What I call them? Fun coupons!
Now, you might be thinking, but Breathed, I have a Switch and Nintendo never discounts any of their games. That's true, but Instant Gaming does. Don't ask me how, they just do. They discount their games for PlayStation 2 and they got PC stuff for you and, of course, Xbox, boo. Yes, that all rhymed.
Because I spit hot fire.
So head on over to Instant Gaming, because it'd be foolish not to get your games from there from now on. It's the same as downloading on Steam or any store. It's all legal, no restrictions, it's all official, it's just cheaper. So click the link in the description below and buy that game you've been thinking about all week, because yesterday you
said tomorrow, so just do it! Make your dreams come true!
And the Druids did do it. They did do it all within Celtic society, actually. They served as conduits to the gods for their religion. They performed rituals. They were also society's first and foremost doctors, men of alchemy, science, philosophy, Renaissance men in a way, 1,500 years before the term Renaissance man was a term. And of course, the Celtic society also had Renaissance women, which I don't think ever became a term, but it should be.
Oh, girls just wanna have
And this is where Boudica comes in, who many think might have been a druid before or while she was married to the Celtic Iceni king Prasutagus. So much for the backstory. Now, the year is 43, which was when the Romans started invading what we now know as England and took down one tribe after the other. So the Iceni king Prasutagus saw the writing on the wall and made sure none of his people rebelled their way against the Romans into certain annihilation. Instead, the king decided that his people would align themselves with the Roman invaders to protect what's theirs. A move historians later famously called a bitch move. I get it. The Romans were a far superior force, and as I said, the Celts were divided amongst themselves, so they were often nurturing wounds from their past infighting, never at full might. So opposing the Romans was silly, and King Prasutagus instead tried to maintain peace by making a deal with Rome, promising that once he is dead, his lands and tribe would fall under their rule as long as his daughters remain in charge, along with whoever is the Roman emperor at the time. And if you know anything about how Rome operated, you know that that's literally making a deal with the devil. The Romans agreed, took over some of the Iceni lands that were part of the agreement, and once they established their presence, they told the Iceni king,
"Look at me, sure. Look at me, sure. I'm the captain now."
They told them that now all their crops and other stuff is grown in service to Rome and Rome only, and that if they want to get it back to, eat and survive, they need to pay taxes and trade with Rome, which was a bit problematic because they were only allowed to pay Rome in sesterces, the Roman currency, a currency that Iceni obviously didn't have, but not to worry, because the Romans were kind enough to loan the Iceni 40 million sesterces, about $60 million today, to trade with and eventually pay back in full with interest. So, as you can see, all in all, the Iceni found themselves in a situation that reputable historians nowadays very accurately describe as they were truly and utterly But as bad as all of this sounds, it was only light foreplay for what was about to come. In the year 54, Emperor Nero took over Rome. And if you don't know anything about Emperor Nero, let me sum him up for you real quick.
I hate most people.
And so in the year 60, when King Prasutagus died, leaving two daughters behind that were too young to rule, his druid wife Boudica found herself in charge of the Iceni. But of course, Nero wasn't really keeping up with the #MeToo movement of the times, so women's lives decidedly did not matter to him, and then Iceni Queen was basically an invitation for him and Rome to completely take over. Emperor Nero sent General Paulinus to do his dirty work. He appointed him to be the governor of all the Celtic lands, of what we now know as England, and so new governor of England, Paulinus, used the loan the Romans gave the Iceni, the loan of 40 million sesterces, as an excuse to invade Iceni lands and have his way with the Iceni people. Paulinus said that their full repayment was actually long overdue, aka due right now, and since they obviously couldn't pay right now, they had to pay with whatever they had. Their belongings, their bodies, their children and their women, and their women's and children's bodies. So the men were enslaved, and the women and children were used and abused by the Roman soldiers, and among those used and abused were the heirs to the throne, the princesses, the Iceni kings and Boudica's daughters, who were only children or at best young teenagers at the time. And when Boudica tried to save her daughters and appeal to the Roman soldiers' better side, reminding them of the agreement her late husband had with the emperor, and that these girls were princesses who were the emperor's equal in these lands, when Boudica tried that, the Romans stripped her naked and brutalized the queen in front of everybody, over and over, for all her people to see. Then they left her and her daughters behind, beaten, bruised, and abused, believing their will to be broken and the Roman message to have been sent. But what they didn't consider is that Boudica, she was built different, and all Rome accomplished by abusing Boudica and her girls was...
I'd like to understand him. Give me that.
Peter Ramos. It's a number to you, you know. One more dead, but a number.
What was she to crazy then?
She showed him it was all right to live again.
And the kidnappers who took that away, huh?
And they're gonna wish they never touched a hair on her head. You know, a man can be an artist. And anything, food, whatever. It depends on how good he is at it. Creasy's art is death. He's about to paint his masterpiece.
Boudica was a woman on a mission now, and she went to every tribe in the region who she knew had all suffered similar fates at the hands of the Romans, so it wasn't all too hard to convince these tribes to set aside their differences, stop the infighting, join Boudica, unite to crush their common enemy, to crush Rome. So before long, Boudica found herself at the head of an army of 120,000 men and women, for the Celts didn't mind men and women fighting together side by side, and Boudica led this army against Rome, purging them out of the Celtic territory they had stolen, one city at a time. The first Roman settlement to fall was Camulodunum, which the Romans had turned into one of their strongholds in the region, and once there, Boudica and her Celts didn't just murder and abuse everybody in the city. They didn't just sack the city, no. They cut the Romans' people's genitals and breasts off and sewed them to their mouth so that they appeared to be eating them, forever defiled even in death. And then Boudica impaled the dead bodies on spears through whatever hole she chose. The Celtic violence knew no limits, and they were sure to pay back the Roman atrocities with at least as much ferocity. Of course, word quickly spread to Rome that some warrior woman riding around on a chariot was leading all these Celts in violent uprisings and already took down a Roman city. So the Romans were like, a woman, you say?
I'll have to ask my accountant about that.
Let's send 200 man slaves to defeat her and teach her a lesson. Yeah, I'm not kidding. They really did send 200 man slaves to fight Boudica's army, which, I repeat, consisted of 120,000 people. Of course, Boudica and her people slapped them around like... And so the Romans then sent 2,500 Roman B-class soldiers to make a stand. But Boudica again was like... And eventually, word of these two other defeats made its way to General Paulinus. Remember, Emperor Nero's appointed governor of England, who realized that, all in all, Paulinus, he had about 1 legion with him in the English territory, that is to say 5,000 good Roman soldiers. There was no way he was ever going to defeat Boudica's army with those numbers, and Boudica of course kept attacking the Romans and their stolen cities one after the other, sacking Londinium, today's London, and Verulamium next, freeing all the Celtic people and growing her army to over 200,000 while killing 80,000 Romans in the process. Needless to say, this was as much of a problem as it was an embarrassment for Rome. Emperor Nero was so embarrassed, in fact, that he considered pulling all of his people out of the conquered English territory. Rome's empire was big enough as it was, and they couldn't afford to be stretched too thin. There was no way they could send the necessary numbers of soldiers into the Celtic lands, but there was also no way they could keep losing battles to an army led by and in large parts consisting of women. So Nero thought it was better to just forfeit and forget that this ever happened. But General Paulinus convinced Emperor Nero that he was up to the task, that he could defeat the Celts, and so Paulinus sent word throughout the region to accumulate more soldiers and eventually got his total numbers up to 10,000 of Rome's finest soldiers. Then he and his 2 legions evacuated every Roman settlement in the Celtic lands and led thousands of Roman refugees away from the dangers of the merciless Boudica taking back her homeland. Paulinus led these civilian refugees into safety, as far away as he could into safer Roman territory, until him and his army decided to make a strategic stand against Boudica. General Paulinus set his army up at a natural choke point, a forest to either side of and behind the legions, a battlefield where the only way for Boudica's army to approach the Romans was to charge at them from straight ahead, over open land, through the forest choke point, where they would then be met by the 10,000 Roman soldiers ready and in formation. This was going to be Rome's last stand, and in what was said to be a speech for the ages, that is also lost to the ages, Paulinus made it clear to his men that they were either going to win here or die, aka be impaled by Boudica with their wieners and eggs stuffed in their mouths. He told his fellow Romans that this battle at this choke point was either going to be their grave or their 300 moment. And sure enough, on the day of the battle in 60 CE, the 2 sides met to either end of the choke point within the forest in an unknown location, and Boudica's massive army sent the ground shaking when they barreled down on the Romans with not just warriors in tow, but also wagons filled with the Celts' families, wagons that set up camp behind the Celtic army to make sure that no Romans can escape this battle. That's how certain Boudica was of her victory. To the Celts, this was their very own death trap. Now the Romans couldn't escape their numbers, neither through the forest they'd chosen to surround themselves with, nor by getting past the Celts. Boudica was sure to end it here, and this was, by all accounts and purposes, the battle for England. 200,000 Celtic warriors versus 10,000 Romans. So the Celtics charged the Roman army through the choke point, fighting as wildly and ferociously as they did chaotically, while the Romans took up formation behind their shields and spears, equipped with superior armor and weapons, waiting to receive the charging enemy. Wave after wave of charging Celts clashed against the Roman shield wall, which regularly rotated its front row of shield and spear-bearing soldiers with fresh soldiers from the back. And ultimately, you should imagine the battle like this. The Celts were this strong, massive, chaotic current that channeled through a choke point into a smaller body of water where it would surely crush and wash away everything with its sheer quantity and velocity. But it just so happened to come up against an immovable object, a solid rock that, despite its smaller size, wouldn't budge. The immovable object proved that the Celts were not actually an unstoppable force. Thousands of Celts died, and eventually they had no choice but to fall back through the choke point, fall back into the open field to try and escape. But tragically, that is where the Celts had set up their circle of wagons containing their families. They had sealed off their own escape route with the bodies of their loved ones. The Celts trying to escape was Rome's signal to switch to a triangular wedge formation to drive the Celtic warriors through the choke point against their own blockade of wagons and crush them. And with that, panic broke out amongst the trapped Celts, who now broke what little rank and structure they had and were slaughtered against their wagons, slaughtered along with their families, their wives, their elderly, and their children. It was an absolute massacre. 80,000 Celts died in that battle, and only 400 Romans lost their lives. Now, there's a problem with this battle and those numbers, because the Celtic people didn't really keep written records, so we don't have a great epic writing from their point of view of them pillaging and embarrassing Rome for years on English territory and killing 80,000 Romans in the process, which they absolutely did that. But we only have the Romans' written account of it, the Roman side of the story. And if anything, Rome probably lowballed those numbers to make themselves not look so bad. In fact, it might be that Boudica never even had 200,000 people following her, and that the Romans exaggerated her numbers to make their losses more acceptable. So, considering that final battle, from today's point of view, it just seems like the Romans basically slapped some death into rebellious children once they started to actually take them seriously. But Rome's ultimate victory wasn't as easy and one-sided as the decisive battle would make it seem. The winners write history, after all, so keep that in mind along with how Boudica tormented Rome for years. But this winner, Rome, went on to continue to build the empire we know, and despite the fear she inspired at the time, Boudica ended up being just a footnote in Rome's greatness. But at the time, at the time she was leading the opposition in the largest conflict Rome ever had on English soil. She was a Celtic warrior queen that nearly ended Rome's ambitions in England, and she led an uprising that, if successful, could have been one of history's greatest what-ifs. As for Boudica herself, her fate, and her life for that matter, is also quite the what-if. Boudica escaped the battle, and we don't know when or how she actually died. The common theory is that she poisoned herself, but really there's absolutely no way to prove that. Just because some Roman writer that never even was near Boudica later wrote that she did die of poison, that doesn't make it true, it just makes it an educated guess. That's much closer to her death than any guess we can venture now. In fact, a lot of what we know now about Boudica are educated guesses, and it's hard to divide her truth from the myths that later exaggerated her legacy. I mean, it's hard to even know if Boudica wasn't actually greater than we know, because maybe the Romans were so embarrassed by this dark chapter in their book of greatness by losing to a woman who had women in her army that they didn't exactly make it a point to document her achievements in great detail. I mean, think about it. The Romans didn't even like to detail their defeats to the former slave Spartacus, but at least Spartacus was a man who once served in the Roman army, who was trained by them. Celtic, wild, barbaric woman Boudica mounting a respectable and largely successful rebellion.
Unforgivable.
And so the Romans buried her story so deep that Boudica was actually forgotten about for a long time, until she re-emerged during the Renaissance and was given new life by painters and later immortalized in statues during the Victorian era, which actually shares Boudica's name. Boudica literally means victorious. Now it has to be said that that is such a foreboding name that many think she might have been just a legend all along, a symbol for victory for the Celts. But then in 2001, archaeologists found a grave, the Wetting graves, where they found the remains of a woman laid to rest with insane respect in a Celtic grave highly decorated with riches and a chariot, just like what Boudica was said to have been riding into battle on. And upon further inspection, it was found that this woman had died in around her 40s and was very tall, and facial reconstruction revealed that her face was disfigured. And one Roman writer did actually describe Boudica as very tall and disfigured, which, without context, sounds like him just trying to give her the barbaric look the Romans attributed to all Celts. But in light of these findings, it serves as proof that Boudica was definitely real. But then in 2017, Oxford University was like, nah, this grave is at least 200 years older than Boudica, so it's not her. But then, and I'm not kidding, then a couple years later, other scientists revealed that carbon dating, which scientists use to determine the age of these excavations, these graves and so on, they said that carbon dating can be often off by a couple of centuries, leaving us back at square one when it comes to Boudica, leaving us with exactly the story I just told you, leaving us with Boudica, the warrior queen that said, "Get the strap," and took Rome for a rough ride. No Vaseline.